Topic 1 of the 3 topics that I said would be covered in this session. How a historical foundation of control and acquisition continues to influence horticulture, and how urban and suburban relationship with gardens, parks, and green spaces can be re-storied around a care and community-based narrative. So the resistance to diversity in horticultural spaces is deeply rooted. As was discussed back in the February session, horticulture originated as a practice of pushing complex diversity back from human habitation. We opened up small pockets within the complex systems to create spaces we could more effectively control and manage. But now the model has been reversed, with the complex systems pushed into ever and ever smaller pockets and the simplified ecosystems occupying the majority of the space. Assembling collections of plants from very far away, colonized lands, was also a status symbol in sort of the transition phase between where horticulture started and where it is now. And growing the difficult and exotic is still a matter of status in many gardening circles. Conversely, growing the easy, adaptable, everyday plants is for beginners. Growing food is for poor people. Not strictly anymore, but I'll come back to that. Plants that fill available space or that grow best within a community of other species, especially if some of those species are grasses, are generally called weedy and aggressive. They are accused of invading the garden. Plants that appear without human permission or assistance to fill ecosystem gaps and catch solar energy and water that would otherwise be lost from the system, and then working with those to build up soil health and diversity. Those are weeds. Much like a lawn or a purely ornamental garden being a statement of social status and wealth, that the landholder has so much that they can afford to waste space and resources, a garden with spaces between plants is kind of also an indication that not every patch needs to be filled to capture and cycle all available resources, and whoever holds that land can afford the time or the staff to go and remove weeds from those spaces between the plants, because spaces don't stay open without a cause. I am speaking from a fairly high water environment, so I do know in arid environments the spaces between plants is natural and lovely. Carry that on, although in those spaces then we tend to actually plant a whole bunch of green stuff that requires lots of water to show well. So different adaptations to different spaces. But this story of sort of control and sort of showing control over and wealth, it does make up the root of current horticultural styles. Those standards that we become comfortable with just because they're familiar, but they do become less comfortable when the reasons behind them start to get discussed. People go, I don't want to dominate my garden. I love my garden. So changing the narrative, what we tend to frame as not being cared for is actually something that is not being controlled and not being sort of dominated. So it's the narrative, the words can change. And a related narrative that we can look at describing and replacing is that something to think about is this demonstration of control and wealth. They are psychologically tied to a sense of safety. The calamity may come for me, but it will come for those with fewer resources first. I have so much that I can afford to waste, so don't even try attacking me. The demonstration of wealth is exhibited in lots of different ways. We do it with clothes and cars and jewelry and houses and all kinds of things. But one of the ways that wealth is demonstrated is through the landscape, and that's where it connects back to us. But that situation where this control sense in the landscape, and also the types of calamities that we're likely to encounter, that has changed from what existed at the start of horticulture. At this point, spaces that lack sort of complex diversity are actually the ones that are the most fragile and vulnerable. Dense, complex systems with lots of points of connection and interrelationship are the ones that will have the best chance of surviving and adapting to a too quickly changing global system. Diversity isn't restricted to the plants either. It extends to people, cultures, foodways, agricultural practices, and so much more. And this narrative can change. And actually, there was a very real example of a shift in the foundation of that narrative of sort of being safe by displaying how controlled and frankly wasteful you could be. As weird as it is, this is real psychological stuff. People have done research on this. But there was a shift away from that in this past year. So many people who had never before considered the possibility of an interruption in food supply did suddenly feel threatened and decided to buy all the seeds and to plant a vegetable garden where previously there was turf. Growing food suddenly stopped being what poor people did with their spaces and their yards, and it became a booming trend. So none of this is fixed. It can move with the right pieces of motivation. And when it comes to changing the narrative of all industries and livelihoods, horticulture is incredibly well placed to shift or pivot, to use the word of the year, from reinforcing fairly harmful norms to being one of the most visible and engaging ways to begin reversing harms. Part of the reason for this flexibility is that at the core, we sell one thing. We modify spaces to make people feel good. That's what we do. That is the core of what we do. What varies is what makes people feel good. By highlighting the narrative and the history that underlies the Western European and the colonial aspects of the story that's currently framing so much of horticulture, and then telling a different story, one of care and vibrant life and of a positive rather than an exploitative role for humans in the complex ecosystems that make up our world, we can change what people feel good about in the landscape. Isn't doing our bit to protect and care for the thriving continuation of life like the most feel-good thing ever? It's all shiny and warm and fuzzy and it just feels right. By limiting horticulture and green space design and care to Western European and UK colonially influenced standards, we really have missed out on so much when it comes to our relationship and interaction with the rest of nature and green spaces in our gardens.